A rainy night, a small-town diner on the edge of nowhere, and a billionaire CEO who walked in wearing an old jacket, hoping to be no one at all. Larry Blaisdell came for coffee and silence, hiding from a world that only saw his money, never the man. But when Maggie Walsh placed the cup in front of him, he froze. Not just because her face mirrored the woman he'd buried 3 years ago, but because her eyes, her laughter, the way she listened without rushing, felt exactly like hers. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know why he kept coming back. And she couldn't imagine that the truth about his identity, about her uncanny connection to his past, would force them both to decide whether love was worth the risk of breaking all over again. Before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. The rain was the kind that clung to you, finding every gap in your coat and sliding down your skin like it had a right to be there. Larry pulled the hood of his worn sweatshirt tighter, the frayed edge brushing his jaw. It wasn't his style, not the real one anyway. The real Larry Blaisdell wore custom suits and Italian leather, shook hands with people whose net worths filled financial magazines, and signed off on contracts worth more than most people made in a lifetime. But tonight, no one in this town knew that man. And that was the point. He pushed open the diner's door, the bell above it giving a tired jingle. The place smelled faintly of coffee and butter, the kind of scent that made time slow down. A waitress was wiping down the counter, her dark hair pulled into a messy braid that trailed over her shoulder. She looked up. The moment stretched, long enough for him to notice the faint sprinkle of freckles on her nose, the way her eyes seemed to weigh the world and still find something kind in it. And for one sharp, disorienting second, he thought he was seeing Alice. He forced his breath out, slow. Not Alice. Alice was gone. This was someone else. "Evening," she said, her voice carrying a note of warmth that didn't feel like the practiced cheer of service. "Sit anywhere you like. We're not exactly swamped." He chose a booth near the window, where the rain blurred the streetlights into soft halos. She brought him a laminated menu, but he barely glanced at it. "What'll it be?" she asked. "Coffee," he said. His voice sounded different here, not the polished, deliberate tone he used in boardrooms. Just him. She nodded, jotting it down even though she didn't need to. "Anything to eat?" He shook his head. When she walked away, he found himself watching her. The way she leaned slightly to hear an older man at the counter. The way she laughed with her whole face, like she wasn't afraid of joy. Alice used to laugh like that. Her name tag read Maggie. The coffee arrived in a chipped mug, steam curling into the air between them. "Long night?" she asked, setting it down. He hesitated. "Something like that. You're passing through?" "Maybe," he said, keeping his answer vague. He didn't want questions. But Maggie didn't push. She just nodded, as if she understood the weight of not wanting to be known. He came back 2 nights later, and then again the week after that. Always in the same booth, always ordering coffee. Sometimes they talked about the weather, about the old jukebox that only played half a song before cutting out, about nothing at all. He told himself it was the coffee, but it wasn't. It was the way her presence made the noise in his head quiet. The way she seemed to see him without asking for anything in return. What he didn't know was that Maggie noticed him too. The careful way he carried himself, like a man used to being watched. The calluses on his hands that didn't match his clothes. The way his gaze sometimes softened, like he was looking at someone else through her. Neither of them said it, but the air between them began to fill with something unspoken. And one night, when the rain was falling just as hard as the first time, she brought him a slice of pie without asking. "On the house," she said. "Why?" "Because you look like you could use something sweet." He almost told her then who he was, why he'd come here, why she reminded him of the love he'd buried and the man he used to be. But he didn't. Not yet. Maggie Walsh didn't believe in strangers becoming fixtures in your life. Not anymore. Too many people had passed through. Friends who got busy, boyfriends who got bored, customers who promised they'd be back and never showed again. So when the quiet man in the old hoodie kept returning, week after week, she tried not to read into it. People came and went. That was life. But he was different. He never stared at his phone. Never spoke just to fill silence. When she asked if he wanted more coffee, he looked up at her like she'd interrupted something worth noticing, and then smiled, just barely. The smile got to her. She didn't know his name. He never offered, and she didn't press. But she noticed things. How he always sat with his back to the wall, facing the door. How his hands were steady when he lifted the mug, but his eyes sometimes flicked toward the rain outside like he was waiting for someone. How he tipped, not big, not small, but in a way that said he thought about it. Maggie had a rule about not imagining stories for customers, but it was hard not to with him. She figured he was traveling for work, maybe construction, maybe trucking. His clothes were too well made to be from the clearance rack, but worn enough to look lived in. The jeans weren't new, but they were tailored, subtle, like he cared, but didn't want anyone to notice. The truth was, Maggie didn't have much space in her life for curiosity. Between double shifts and her dad's doctor appointments, she barely had time to breathe. Her father, Frank, had been an ironworker for 30 years before the stroke. Now he spent most days in the recliner, the left side of his body stubborn and uncooperative. Maggie's younger sister, Claire, was still in high school, and Maggie was determined not to let her drop out to help. That meant Maggie worked. All the time. Some nights she came home smelling of coffee and fryer oil, her hands raw from scrubbing counters. She'd tiptoe past her father's room, check on Claire's homework, and fall asleep without even changing out of her uniform. The diner was just a job, nothing more. But when he came in, the air felt lighter. One Thursday night, a storm had knocked the power out in half the town. The diner ran on backup generators, the overhead lights dim and flickering. Maggie was working the counter when the door swung open, and there he was, water dripping from his hood. "You're soaked," she said. "I walked," he replied, settling into his usual booth. "From where?" He hesitated, as if calculating how much to say. "A few miles." She poured his coffee and slid it across the table. "That's dedication." "Maybe I just like the pie," he said. She smiled, and for a second, something unguarded passed between them. Something warm, almost dangerous. When her shift slowed, she found herself leaning on the booth opposite him. "So, mystery man, what do you do when you're not here?" His fingers tapped the side of the mug. "Nothing interesting. That's for me to decide." He met her eyes, and she saw it, the flicker of hesitation, the way his jaw tightened like he was holding back an entire history. "I used to run things," he said finally. "What kind of things?" "Business." He gave a small shrug, as if that was the whole story. "Well, now you run up my coffee tab," she said, nudging his mug toward her. He laughed then, not loud but real, and Maggie thought, maybe she'd done something good tonight. What she couldn't know was that Larry Blaisdell, billionaire, widower, and man who'd spent 3 years living behind glass walls, felt more himself in this diner than anywhere else. And what he didn't know was that Maggie's resemblance to Alice wasn't just in her face. It was in her voice when she asked about his day without trying to fix it. It was in the way she gave people the best seat in the place without making them feel like charity. It was in her unhurried silences. That night, as she refilled his cup one last time, she said, "Careful. Keep coming back like this, and people will start thinking you live here." He looked up at her, eyes steady. "Maybe I wouldn't mind." Maggie didn't know why that made her heart skip. She only knew she was smiling as she walked away, and that, for the first time in months, the weight on her shoulders felt a little lighter. Saturday night at the diner was always loud. Cutlery clinking, conversations overlapping, the hiss of the grill in the back. Maggie was halfway through balancing 3 plates on her arm when she saw him walk in. No hoodie this time, just a plain black sweater and jeans, but there was something about the way they fit that told her he wasn't the sort of man who picked clothes at random. She caught herself staring and forced her attention back to the table in front of her. He waited for his usual booth, patient in the way of someone used to waiting for things to come to him. When she brought him coffee, she noticed his hands, steady, sure, with that strange mix of callous and refinement, like he'd built things once, then spent years holding things far more delicate. "You work Saturdays now?" she asked, sliding the mug toward him. "I work every day," he said with a faint smile. "That's not healthy." He didn't answer, just took a slow sip of coffee. The truth was, Larry hadn't planned to come tonight. He'd been in a video conference all afternoon, discussing a merger worth hundreds of millions. His assistant had texted him 3 times about follow-ups. But the moment the meeting ended, the walls of his penthouse felt too silent, and the thought of sitting across from Maggie Walsh, hearing her laugh, felt like the only thing he actually wanted to do. She came back with a slice of pecan pie. "On the house," she said. "You keep saying that. At this rate, I'm going to owe you half my life. Half your life's not worth much if all you do is drink coffee and stare at the rain," she replied. And then she gave him a quick grin before turning to another table. Larry watched her move through the diner, refilling cups, leaning in to listen to the older couple in the corner, sliding extra napkins toward the family with 2 toddlers. She was everywhere at once, but never hurried in a way that made people feel they were in the way. Alice used to do that, not in a diner, but in their home, hosting dinner parties, remembering every guest's favorite drink, listening so intently that people forgot they were in the presence of someone who could buy the street they lived on. The resemblance wasn't just visual anymore. It was muscle deep, spirit deep. Halfway through his pie, a man in a suit walked in. Not the sort of man who belonged in this diner. Larry recognized him instantly. Patrick, one of his junior partners. Patrick froze when he saw him, eyes flicking from Larry's sweater to the half-empty mug. "Mr. Blaisdell." Larry's gaze snapped sharp, a warning in his eyes. Patrick caught it. "Larry, sorry, I didn't realize. Coffee's good here," Larry said evenly, cutting him off. "You should try it." Patrick hesitated, clearly unsure whether to sit or flee. "Of course. Nice seeing you." And then he turned, heading for the door without ordering. Maggie had been standing a few feet away, holding an empty coffee pot. "Friend of yours?" she asked casually when she came to refill his cup. Something like that. She didn't push, but she didn't quite buy it either. The rest of the night, he caught her glancing his way, not suspicious, exactly, but curious in a way she hadn't been before. By closing time, the rain had stopped. Larry waited near the counter while she wiped down the last table. You need a ride home? He asked. I walk, she said. So do I. She hesitated, then nodded. They stepped out into the damp night air, the streetlights casting halos on the wet pavement. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt deliberate, like they were both aware of every unspoken word hanging there. At the corner, she stopped. This is me. He glanced at the small brick building, the dim light in a second-floor window. You live here, with my dad and my sister, she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. It's not much. Sounds like enough, he said quietly. She looked at him for a moment longer, as if deciding whether to ask something, then shook her head. See you Monday? I'll be here. As he walked away, he realized he'd meant it. What he didn't see was Maggie standing there for a moment longer, watching him go, wondering why a man who looked like he belonged anywhere in the world kept choosing a booth in her diner. The Monday rush was in full swing when Maggie spotted him. Not in his usual booth, but standing at the far end of the counter, talking to someone she didn't recognize. The man he was speaking to wore a suit so sharp it looked like it had been poured onto him, and there was something about the way both men carried themselves that made them stand out from the rest of the crowd. Larry caught her looking and offered the smallest nod, like an unspoken promise that he'd be over soon. But before she could refill the coffee pot and make her way toward him, the suited man handed him a thick envelope and murmured something she couldn't catch. Larry's jaw tightened. He slid the envelope into his jacket without opening it. When he finally made it to his booth, he looked heavier, somehow, like he'd walked in with rain on his shoulders no one else could see. You okay? She asked, setting his mug down. He looked at her for a moment before answering. You ever feel like the life you're living isn't the one you were supposed to have? Her hand paused on the coffee pot. Every day. Something in his expression softened at that. The day passed in a blur of orders and clattering dishes. Maggie tried not to think about the envelope, about the way his eyes seemed to hold entire conversations he wasn't having out loud. But later that night, after the dinner rush, she noticed he'd left his jacket on the back of the booth. She hesitated only a second before picking it up. Something slipped from the inside pocket, a small, leather-bound notebook. She bent to retrieve it, intending to tuck it back in, but the corner of an embossed business card caught her eye. Blaisdell International Holdings, Lawrence A. Blaisdell, Chief Executive Officer. The letters blurred for a moment before she realized she was holding her breath. CEO. Not a contractor. Not a traveling salesman. Not the man she'd built in her mind over the past few weeks. She snapped the notebook shut just as he returned from the restroom. You found my jacket, he said, taking it from her. Yeah, she replied, forcing her voice to stay even. Wouldn't want you to lose something important. If he noticed the edge in her tone, he didn't show it. The rest of his visit was quiet. Too quiet. She took his payment, watched him leave, and stood at the window long after he disappeared down the street. That night, Maggie couldn't sleep. She sat at the small kitchen table in their apartment, her father's snores drifting from the next room, and stared at the business card lying on the wood in front of her. She told herself she had no right to feel anything. He'd never actually lied about who he was. He'd just not told her. But it gnawed at her. Not because of the money, but because she'd thought he came to the diner for the same reason she stayed, to be exactly who you were without pretending. The next day, he came in at his usual time. She greeted him like always, but there was a subtle difference. The warmth was still there, but it was shielded like a flame behind glass. Midway through his coffee, she finally asked, Why here? He looked up from the mug. Why anywhere? No, she said, leaning on the edge of the booth. Why this place? You could be anywhere, eating whatever you want, wherever you want. So why a diner that serves pie on paper plates? His eyes searched hers, and for a long moment he didn't answer. Then he said, because here I'm just the guy who drinks too much coffee. Not the man with the money. Not the man people think they know. And the hoodie? She pressed. He almost smiled. A disguise that works better than you'd think. She wanted to believe him. Part of her did. But another part whispered that she was just a passing curiosity to him. An escape from a life he'd chosen, but could leave behind whenever it suited him. When she walked away to check on another table, he watched her go with a heaviness in his chest. She didn't know it, but she looked almost exactly like Alice when she was angry. The same quiet restraint, the same stubborn set of the jaw. And he hated that he'd put that look on her face. For the rest of the week, Maggie kept her distance. She still served him coffee, still smiled when their eyes met. But it was the kind of smile she gave any customer. Polite, safe, impossible to misread. Larry felt the change like a door quietly closing. He tried to keep things normal, same booth, same order, same easy small talk. But every time he caught her gaze, he saw the questions there. Questions she wasn't asking anymore because she didn't want the answers. On Friday, he waited until the diner emptied out before speaking. She was wiping down the counter, her braid loose from the dinner rush, a smudge of flour on her cheek. "You're avoiding me," he said. "I'm working," she replied without looking up. "You weren't like this before." She set the rag down and finally met his eyes. "Before, I thought you were here because you wanted to be, not because it was convenient. That's not what this is, isn't it?" she asked. "You walk in here dressed like a guy who works with his hands, sit in that booth like you've been coming here your whole life and talk like none of it matters. But it does matter, Larry. Or should I say Lawrence A. Blaisdell, Chief Executive Officer." He froze. "You found out. I found a card in your jacket." She crossed her arms. "I guess I should have guessed earlier. The way you carry yourself. The way people look at you." He stepped closer. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want that to be the first thing you knew about me." "Then what did you want me to know?" she asked. "The version of you that orders coffee and listens to the jukebox? Or the man who can buy this whole street and never think twice?" "Both," he said quietly. "Because both are me." She shook her head. "You can walk out of this place whenever you want. I can't. My dad's care, my sister's school, they depend on me being here. This is my whole life. And I don't know if you're here because you see me or because you see her." The word hung there. Her. Alice. Larry's chest tightened. "You remind me of her." "First, yes. But it's not the same. You're not her, Maggie. And I don't want you to be." "Then what do you want?" she asked, almost a whisper. He didn't hesitate. "I want to know you without the world between us." She looked at him for a long moment, and for a second he thought she might say something that would change everything. But then she reached for her apron, untied it, and hung it on the hook by the kitchen door. "I think you should go, Larry." He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He just left the cash on the counter and walked out into the cold night air, the sound of the bell above the door still ringing in his ears long after it shut behind him. That night, Maggie sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold. Claire was asleep, her father's TV murmuring softly from the other room. The business card lay in front of her again, its edges worn from being picked up and put down too many times. She wanted to believe him, but believing meant risking the quiet balance she'd built, and she wasn't sure she could survive losing it. Across town, in a penthouse he hated coming home to, Larry poured himself a drink he didn't really want and stared at the city skyline. He had spent years mastering the art of keeping people at arm's length. And in just a few weeks, Maggie Walsh had made that distance unbearable. He set the glass down untouched. Maybe the disguise had been a mistake. Maybe pretending to be someone else had only made the truth harder to tell. But he knew one thing. He wasn't ready to let her walk away. Not yet. 2 days passed before Maggie saw him again. Not in the diner, but through the rain-streaked front window of her apartment building. At first, she thought she was imagining him. The man standing on the sidewalk, hood pulled back, hair damp, holding something in his hands. But when she opened the door, the cold air hit her, and so did the truth. "Larry, I know you asked me to go," he said, voice steady despite the rain. "And I will if that's still what you want. But there's something I need to give you first." He held out a small, flat package wrapped in brown paper. She hesitated, then took it. Inside was a framed photograph, not of Alice, not of him, of the diner, her diner. The corner booth bathed in afternoon light, a mug in the center of the table, a slice of pie waiting. "I had someone take it last week," he said, "because that's where I started to feel like myself again. And it's because of you." She looked up at him, rain sliding down her temple. "Larry." "No," he interrupted gently. "I need to say this. When I came here, I thought I was hiding. From my name, my life, my own mistakes. And then you walked up with that first cup of coffee and I couldn't hide anymore. You reminded me of her at first, yes. But you've kept me here because you're you. And I've spent too long pretending not to want more than that." She didn't speak. She was afraid if she did, her voice would give away too much. "I can't promise it'll be simple," he said. "I live in a world that's loud and sharp and full of people who see me as what I can give them. But I can promise you I will never ask you to be anyone but yourself. Not her. Not anyone else." Maggie's hands tightened on the frame. "I don't care about the money," she said quietly. "I care about knowing the ground I'm standing on is real. No games. No disguises." "Then no more disguises," he said. For a moment, all they heard was the rain on the street. Then she stepped aside, just enough for him to follow her in. Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of tea and laundry soap. Claire was on the couch, sketchbook in hand, and their father dozed in the recliner. Maggie set the frame on the kitchen counter. "You hungry?" she asked. Larry smiled. Not the careful, measured one she'd seen before, but something warmer. "Starving." They ate leftovers at the small table, knees bumping under the wood. Claire told him about a school art project, and he listened like it was the most important thing he'd heard all week. Later, when Maggie walked him to the door, he paused. "I'm not going to pretend this is the end of the story," he said. "I think it's just the first chapter." She gave him a small, almost shy smile. "Then I guess you'd better keep showing up." "I will," he promised. And for once, she believed him. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the street washed clean. Larry walked away with his hands in his pockets, feeling something he hadn't in years, the quiet certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And behind him, in a second-floor window, Maggie watched until he disappeared around the corner, the frame of the diner glowing softly in her kitchen light. Not the end, just the beginning.